Good evening, Husky fans. Thank you for tuning in to the 26th episode of Husky Dash. I'm your host, Nathan Mathisen, and today I'm going to be starting off the show with a position breakdown segment. And this week's breakdown is going to be of the inside linebacker group for the Huskies football team. After talking Husky football, I'll transition back into talking about Husky basketball by looking at what changed over this past week for Husky basketball, and then looking ahead towards next season for this team. Feel free to leave any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I'll do my best to respond to them. Now, before getting into this episode, a bit of news for the Huskies. So there's 5 Husky signees of the class of 2021 for the football team that made the Washington All-State High School Football First Team. Those 5 are Sam Heward, Jabez Tene, Caden Jumper, Owen Prentice, and Will Latu. Another bit of news is this game against Cal this week for the Husky basketball team on Saturday is senior night for the Huskies. They have 3 seniors, Quade Green, Hamir Wright, and Travis Rice. All right, so getting into the first segment, the position preview for next season for the football team. And it's going to be the inside linebacker group, which I think it's a little weaker than the coaches especially want to believe and want the fans to think, especially with what Lake said at his press conference a while back when he announced Gregory as the defensive coordinator. He kind of talked about the linebacker group as being a strength of this Husky squad in the past and praised Gregory for it. However, looking at the numbers for the inside linebackers, which really the run game and inside linebacker productions kind of correlates very closely, as an inside linebacker's job is really to step up, fill the gap, make the tackle at the line of scrimmage, and stop the other team's run game. So a good measure of a team's linebacker is kind of the defensive yards per game allowed on the ground. And for the Huskies this past season, albeit in just the 4 games that they had, the overall numbers weren't very good. In 2020, they allowed 161 yards per game on the ground. And this might have been good enough for 5th in the Pac 12. However, it's not really up to the standards that the Huskies had been performing to in past years. Looking at 2019, they only gave up 129 yards per game, which is 32 yards less. And each year going back, it gets lower and lower. In 2018, they only gave up 116 yards per game. And then in 2017 was their best year, really the peak was only 101 yards per game on the ground. So the rush defense has just continuously gotten worse and worse as the years have progressed from 2017 onwards. And that's kind of because they haven't really recruited very well at the inside linebacker position. And looking at this year's number again of 161 yards per game, if you actually look into that number and each individual game, because there was only 4 games total. So you have 3 games where they struggled immensely. Against Oregon State, 167 yards they gave up on the ground. Against Utah, it was 215. And then against Stanford, the last game, 191. The one game where the Husky run defense really showed up was against Arizona, but really every defense stepped up against Arizona because they struggled immensely on offense. So overall, the Huskies' rush defense, when they were playing a decent or average team on the ground, they gave up huge holes and gave up big runs. Part of this issue is when your clear-cut best player at a position group is a walk-on player, then that signifies to me that you're not recruiting well enough at that position. Now, that's no knock on Edifon Ulofoshio. He's a great player. He's clearly great. He got some great recognition after the season. But I'm really just saying that Washington should have been able to recruit a top-ranked player like a 4-star. And they have a couple 4-stars, but they just didn't produce, I guess. Maybe even a 5-star Washington could have recruited. As really in recent years, they've had success going to 4 New Year's Six bowl games in the past 5 or so seasons it is. So the Huskies do this year have another 4-star linebacker joining the group, and that's Will Latu. Latu is a 4-star out of Bethel, Washington, and I do like Latu a lot. I think he can develop into a good linebacker and be successful for the Huskies. But at the moment, he'll probably have to take a year or two to really develop his game and develop into a good college football linebacker. Now he's got okay size, 6'2", 230 pounds, and in college you can be very successful at that size. I think a personal preference, I think he might want to bulk up just a bit, get to 235, 240, and be a stout run defender for this Huskies. And that's really what they're missing at that position. At the inside linebacker position, the Huskies kind of have some good speed, some good side to side across the field guys in Sermon and Ulafosio, who they're also both 230 pounds. Now, Ulafosio definitely stood his ground more in the run game than Sermon, but both you could look at clips of them getting beat by the opposing team in the run game. And Sermon's biggest problem with this was, from what I watched, is he would miss tackles, make the wrong read, and then end up getting cut off from the running back by one of the pulling offensive linemen. Now, Ulafosio did great in a lot of instances. He had a bunch of tackles, led the team in tackles by far. But a piece of critique for him is really just getting to the hole, meeting the running back at the line of scrimmage or behind the line of scrimmage. As often was the case, Ulafosio he'd be left on an island for the running back 5 yards down or 5 yards past the line of scrimmage. So he wouldn't be getting up the line of scrimmage and making contact with the running back until they've already got a full head of steam and they end up getting 6+ yards on the carry. I don't know what was the reason for this. He wasn't trusting his eyes, maybe. Something just wasn't going right. As in any game, you could really point this out of Ulafosio making the tackle, but then you see like it's 1st and 10, they run it, next thing you know, it's 2nd and 3 after a big gain. Now, Latu, as a true freshman, I could easily see him earning some reps. And as at this linebacker core by no means is deep. It's got a really just the first two, Sermon and Ulafosio. I mean, Sermon even could be replaced if one of these other guys step up in spring practice. But overall, the linebacker core isn't the deepest. And if Latu develops quickly and has a good practice, spring practice and fall camp, then he could get some early snaps in at linebacker. But with this being Ulafosio and Sermon's second year together, I mean, there's hope that they can develop a good chemistry and can work in unison more this upcoming season and really shore up some of those shortcomings of this past season for that position group. Last week, I looked at the defensive back position group and talked about how they're the clear strong point from the team last season, as well as looking like another clear strong point of this team for this upcoming season. And now looking at this inside linebackers position group, they were probably a clear weak point from last year. And with no huge instant difference making recruits or transfers, and with Gregory still coaching them, I see more run game struggles to continue into the upcoming season for the Husky linebacker position group. So now moving on towards basketball again, really just it's all about the man defense, I think, because you can finally say that Hopkins is actually playing man-to-man defense instead of that 2-3 defense, 2-3 zone defense that he just loves from coming from Syracuse and being a Syracuse guy. I mean, it's taken over a month and a half, but I think Hopkins has finally realized that this 2-3 zone defense, it does not work with the current personnel and the current players that he has on the team. He simply doesn't have a zone defense team. What he has is a man-to-man defense team, and I might be willing to go out on a limb here and say that they're a pretty good man-to-man defense. Now, that might be a bit of a hot take, and there really is just such a small sample size of this. But looking into that small numbers before this past week, which I really think was the first time that Hopkins went all in on the man defense. They'd probably been practicing it for a week or so leading up to these games this week and really nailing it down. And then he implemented it and just stuck with it through the whole entirety of all three of these past games they played. But before those games, the Huskies were surrendering 79 points per game on average. And in the past three games, since they turned to the man-to-man defense for the whole 40 minutes, they surrendered 69 points, 64 points, and 63 points. And I get it that that's a very small sample size and just to take that with a grain of salt. But as it's not nearly as good of a number as the 17 games with 79 points per game. But then something else to really look into is the previous three times that the Huskies played the teams they played this past week in man-to-man defense. The first time the Huskies met USC was back January 14th. And at that instance, the Huskies were still just zone defense, full on, trying to just do it, and run it into the ground, basically just failing over and over again. And so when the Huskies played USC back then, they gave up 95 points. Now, 95 points compared to 69 points is a huge difference and a huge improvement overall for the Husky defense. Looking into the last time they met UCLA before this past week, that was right along the January 14th time when they played USC before. So they were still all in on that zone defense, playing that for the entirety of the game. And against UCLA the first time, they gave up 81 points per game, or 81 points in that game. So you look, another huge improvement going from 81 points in the zone defense to only 64 points in the man-to-man defense, or 64 points in the man-to-man defense. And the final measure of that is against Wazoo, where when they first played Wazoo, it was only a couple of weeks ago. So they had started to kind of mix in that zone defense with the man-to-man defense. But still, it was still a transition and a work in progress, really, for the Huskies, as this might have been the first game that you could say they ran the zone for more, or ran the man defense for more than a couple possessions in a row. So they hadn't practiced it much and were not the best at it. And they ended up giving up 77 points against the Cougars in the first meeting. And now here in the second meeting, where they went just full on man-to-man defense, they gave up 63 points. And really after that first meeting with the Cougars on this show, I talked about the Huskies should look to continue to work that man-to-man defense in more and more, and eventually kind of transfer to just running that. And Hopkins clearly did this, saw this. He'd been working on it in practice with the team, as there was a huge improvement from that game when they were in the man-to-man defense to these games against USC, UCLA, and Wazoo, where they ran it the whole time. Just continuously practicing that defense will only make them better at it. Now, even with this much improved defense, the Huskies still only went 1-2 this past week. And why is that, you ask? Well, I think it's as simple as the teams they played are just really, they're just really good. You look at it as they played USC, who, I mean, USC is the number one team in the Pac-12. Then they played UCLA. Who's UCLA? Well, it might have been in a little slump there, but they're still the number 2 Pac-12 team for standing. So they played the number 1 team in the Pac-12 and the number 2 team in the Pac-12. So going into this past week, I said on last week's show that I wouldn't be shocked if the Huskies lose by 20 plus points and be blown out by both these schools. Now the Huskies ended up only losing by 3 to UCLA, so another close game against UCLA. The first time they met, they lost by 5, I believe it is. And against USC this week, they lost by 15. Another strong defensive outing for the Huskies, but a poor offensive showing, especially in that USC game. And that brings up really a key weakness for this Husky squad, and that's just scoring. To start the year, the Huskies had 2 issues: defense and offense. And when you have issues on defense and offense, you're obviously not going to have a good record, and that's what the Huskies have, a bad record. This is just their 4th win, I believe, on the year. And looking at the games against Colorado and Utah, that was those two games. The first time they played them, they played horribly. And then the second time they played Colorado and Utah 3 or so weeks ago, it was, I can't exactly remember. Their offense clicked in those games and they squeaked out 2 wins. Now, in order to win consistently, you can't just be good on one side of the ball. You have to be good on both sides, and you have to be able to make buckets with consistency as well as stopping the opposing team from scoring, or you just won't win. It doesn't matter if you can effectively shut down your opponent offensively, as if your offense isn't very good, it's going to be very hard to win. That's why this past week, the Huskies' defense was strong, yet they only got 1 win, and that was against the Cougars, which they just squeaked by, winning 65-63. Now, the Huskies managed to win that with the poor offensive showing, shooting 42% from the field and 35% from deep. Their offense was clearly struggling, but that was an incident where the defense just barely made up for that and just managed to come out of that game with a win. And you can't rely on that from game to game. You just can't rely on your offense outscoring the other team's offense game out and game in, or your defense just shutting out the other team's offense. So really, the best teams are always, or almost always, the most complete teams. And that works in just about any sport you play. The team that's the best is the team that can do it the best on both ends of it. Now, what the Huskies have to do is really figure out how to perform well both defensively and offensively, as they truly haven't done that in any game so far this year. So that'll be something to keep an eye on if the Huskies can keep this man-to-man defense going and keep performing well at it. If they can start finding their shot again, like they had that little glimpse they had a couple weeks ago where their offense was finally clicking. Now, getting into the last segment, it's going to be looking towards the future for this Husky basketball team. And really just getting into it, the key players for next year that will be gone, or in all likelihood gone, will be Quade Green and Amir Wright. Both of them are seniors, so both of them won't have any eligibility left. Green's an interesting case, as there might be some loophole for him to have eligibility left with him having transferred from Kentucky his sophomore year, playing 9 games there, and then coming to UW and his junior year only playing 15 games because of being suspended to end the year with academic ineligibility. But in all the more likelihood, Amir Wright and Quade Green will both be gone next year. So who does that really leave? The Huskies. And just a quick assumption that I'm going to be making is I don't really expect any of one to opt out or to enter into the NBA draft early, as quite frankly, personally, I don't think any of these young guys or even juniors are good enough for that, or would be a wise move at all for them to make. That's just something that I'll be assuming won't happen. So that leaves us with the core players for next year. That'll be Jamal Bay, Nate Roberts, Eric Stevenson, Cole Badgema, and Marcus Sahonis. Those are the guys who have been getting the most minutes so far this year, and the guys that will all, in all likelihood, be back next year as well. Now, the coaching staff also appears as though it will be the exact same, with Jen Cohn in an interview a couple weeks ago giving her full support to Mike Hopkins. And looking at that squad that's put together, putting a few role players in, Riley Sornerly and a couple other guys. And Nate Pryor should be back as well. So Soren, Pryor, a couple young guys coming off the bench. It's hard to believe that they'd be much better than they are currently. I mean, you also look at the recruits that they're getting. They have one recruit for next year signed, and that's a 4-star center out of a little city in Washington, and that's Jackson Grant. But I find it hard to believe that he'll really make an immediate impact for the Huskies, especially with Nate Roberts and Riley Sorn still being there for next year. Jackson Grant can take that year to kind of improve upon his skills, maybe build some muscle as he's a little on the small size at only 205 pounds. And as far as young guys in the that they've been developing from the class of 2020, UW ended up only having one recruit this past year. He was actually a late addition, Dominique Penn. He originally was for the class of 2020, and then he reclassified to the class of 2021. And then partway through the season, he decided to reclassify again back to the class of 2020, and he signed with Washington. He joined the team at the start of this quarter here, and as far as I'm aware, he he's been at the games. I haven't seen him in the game. He hasn't gotten in any games or anything, but he's with the team, I believe, practicing. And he was a three-star guard coming out of high school, so he's not looked at someone who's going to make an immediate impact or really being a huge signing in my eyes. He likely won't be contributing for the rest of this year, and maybe next year he'll be able to get in the rotation. But again, you look at it with Pryor starting at point guard, likely you got, or not Pryor, Sahonis starting at point guard, then Pryor coming off the bench. I mean, maybe he can get a couple minutes, but overall, he might not be making an impact for this team. Now, looking at the transfer, if they'll get any transfers, I don't know. Perhaps he'll get a big name transfer, but I find that hard to believe just with how the Huskies have been performing on basketball. I don't see any guys who would want to come here, want to play for Hopkins with his recent track record. So overall, at the moment, it appears as though they won't be getting much help for next year in the terms of replacing Green and replacing Amir Wright. They'll only really be losing those guys. So if the Huskies really want to have any sort of success next year, it's really going to rely on Marcus Sahonis going and developing even further than he has throughout this season. And really, Sahonis is going to have to become what Quad A Green is this year, and even better if they want to actually win. From what I've seen from this past week, that's definitely possible. The knock that I had with Sahonis earlier is that he wasn't really consistent, and I think part of that falls on Mike Hopkins as the coach. He really wasn't giving him consistent minutes. Some games Sahonis would play 20 plus minutes. Other games he barely touched the court. And for a player, that's really hard to get in a role or get in sync when you don't have reliable minutes. This past week, when Sahonis was getting good minutes, except against USC, he carried the load nicely against the Cougars without Green. He went 13 for 20, scoring 29 points, which was a career high for him. Now against UCLA, he went 7 for 15, scoring 22 points. But then against USC was a game where he struggled. He only managed to get 14 minutes of playing time in that game. With the other games, him getting 20 plus minutes. Again, there's that rotation of Hopkins just cutting someone out for, I don't know why. I mean, he wasn't performing overly well. He was 1 for 7 shooting. So I guess it's understandable for him not to be on the court as much. Green was performing very well the second half, so it was probably just left Green in where he scored. I believe that was one of his better games in the past. But then looking again at Sahonis and looking at the games against Oregon for him, he was back up to 23 minutes he played in that game. Shot 6 of 10, 15 points. So, and then against Oregon State, he went 8 for 13, 22 points. So really looking at 4 of the last 5 games, he was extremely efficient in them, scoring nicely. And in all those games, really, Sahonis is good for 2, 3 rebounds and assists each game. So overall, Sahonis has proven to be, at least in the past week or two, he's proven to be what the Huskies hoped Raekwon Battle would be this year and more. Sahonis is a guy who can shoot the ball from deep, and then he also has the ability, similar to Quad A Green, where he can get a shot off when he wants to. He can make offense for himself and create offense for the other guys on the team. And that's why really Sahonis needs to be getting 25 minutes per game this year and still coming off the bench, kind of being that sixth man role where he can lead the offense while Green is getting his rest in. And then he can also be out there alongside Green, spot up shooting, just being out there scoring off the ball. Quite frankly, just taking the weight off Green's shoulder. That's what Sahonis has been able to do when he's been able to be out on the court and perform well. At the start of the year, Green was out there all by himself, basically carrying the entire team, and that didn't work. With Sahonis performing nicely these last few weeks, Huskies might not be winning many, but they're competing, and it's actually being close games. The real question, though, is next year without what happens? Is it basically just going to be like the start of this year where you're looking at it as Sahonis is the only guy in the Huskies who can score and he's having to carry the load offensively? And that's really where Bay comes in, and he has to take a step forward alongside Sahonis. He has to be the guy who's been performing like these past few weeks from day one. And he has to shoot more, that's for sure. He has to be assertive next year and take more shots. As currently, he's shooting over 50% from three, but he hasn't even shot more than 50 of them. I mean, this past game against the Cougars, he only shot the ball 5 times. So ideally, next season, Sahonis should be shooting the ball around 20 times per game. Well, Bay should be putting up around 15 shots per game. Those two guys are the clear leaders on the offense. I mean, they're the most talented, and they have to be the guys the offense runs through if the Huskies want any hope of having a successful year. Because Bay currently is shooting lights out, like I said, from three, shooting over 50%. And with his size, he's 6'6", so he should be able to develop an inside game where he can drive to the rim, take the contact, and really get to the free throw line or even make the layup through the contact. If those things don't happen, then there's really no reason to believe this Husky squad will be any better than they are right now. All right, then. That just about finishes up the episode for today. Once again, thank you for joining me. I'm Nathan Mathisen. You can follow me on Twitter with the @ that you see on the screen right now. And I'm just a small part of the Dash Sports family. So if you'd like to meet the rest of the crew, check out our website, dashsports.tv. That's where you can find as many clips, quips, tips, rips, terrible jokes, and as many full episodes as you can stand, all in one place, all for free, dashsports.tv. I'll see you next week with more Husky basketball, as well as another Husky football position group breakdown. But for now, this is Husky Dash signing off. Thank you.